Globalization and Its Discontents by Joseph E. Stiglitz is a seminal work that critiques the practices and outcomes of globalization as driven by international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate in economics and former chief economist at the World Bank, provides a scathing analysis of how these institutions have implemented policies that, while ostensibly aimed at fostering global economic growth, often exacerbate inequality and undermine economic stability in developing countries. Overview of the book. Stiglitz argues that globalization, in its current form, has been shaped by powerful industrialized nations to serve their own economic interests. These nations, through their influence over international financial institutions, impose policies on developing countries that frequently lead to adverse outcomes. The author emphasizes that globalization is not inherently bad. Rather, it is the way globalization is managed that has led to widespread discontent. The book is divided into chapters that analyze the roles of the IMF, the World Bank, and other international bodies in shaping the global economy. Stiglitz uses real-world examples to illustrate the failures and unintended consequences of their policies, drawing extensively from his own experiences within these organizations. The role of the IMF. One of Stiglitz's main criticisms is directed at the IMF, which he accuses of pushing a one-size-fits-all approach to economic policy. The IMF's standard prescription, fiscal austerity, liberalization of trade and capital markets, and privatization, has, according to Stiglitz, often worsened economic crises rather than alleviating them. He points out that the IMF frequently imposes these policies without considering the specific circumstances of individual countries. For example, during the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, the IMF insisted on tight monetary policies and austerity measures in countries such as Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea. These policies, according to Stiglitz, deepened the recession, increased unemployment, and led to widespread social unrest. The IMF's insistence on rapid liberalization of capital markets also made these economies vulnerable to speculative attacks, further destabilizing their financial systems. The World Bank and structural adjustment. Stiglitz is somewhat more sympathetic to the World Bank, acknowledging that it has occasionally implemented programs that have been beneficial. However, he criticizes its structural adjustment programs, which have often imposed harsh conditions on borrowing countries. These conditions typically include reducing government spending, eliminating subsidies, and opening up markets to foreign competition. The impact of these policies has been particularly severe in Africa and Latin America. For instance, many African countries were forced to cut spending on health and education to meet the World Bank's requirements. This not only stunted economic development, but also exacerbated poverty and inequality. Stiglitz argues that these policies reflect a failure to recognize the importance of investing in human capital and building strong institutions for long-term growth. Trade liberalization and inequality. Stiglitz also critiques the WTO for promoting trade liberalization in a way that disproportionately benefits developed countries. He points out that while developing countries have been pressured to open their markets, developed nations often maintain subsidies and tariffs that protect their own industries, particularly in agriculture. This creates an uneven playing field, preventing poorer countries from competing effectively in global markets. Moreover, Stiglitz highlights the link between globalization and rising inequality. He notes that within both developing and developed countries, globalization has widened the gap between the rich and the poor. In developing countries, the benefits of globalization often accrue to a small elite, while the majority of the population faces job losses, wage stagnation, and reduced access to essential services. In developed countries, globalization has contributed to the erosion of manufacturing jobs and downward pressure on wages, fueling political backlash and populism. Failures of democratic accountability. A recurring theme in globalization and its discontents is the lack of democratic accountability in the decision-making processes of international financial institutions. Stiglitz argues that these institutions are often dominated by a few powerful countries, particularly the United States, which use their influence to advance their own economic and political agendas. As a result, the the policies implemented by these institutions often fail to reflect the needs and priorities of the countries they are meant to assist. Stiglitz also criticizes the lack of transparency in the operations of the IMF and the World Bank. Decisions are often made behind closed doors, with little input from the governments and citizens of affected countries. This lack of transparency undermines trust in these institutions and fuels resentment against globalization. Alternative approaches to globalization. While Stiglitz is critical of the current model of globalization, he does not advocate for its complete rejection. Instead, he calls for a more inclusive and equitable approach that prioritizes the needs of developing countries and vulnerable populations. He proposes several reforms to achieve this goal. 1. Tailored economic policies. Stiglitz argues that economic policies should be designed to reflect the specific circumstances of each country. Rather than imposing a standardized set of policies, international institutions should work closely with national governments to develop strategies that promote sustainable and inclusive growth. 2. Investment in education and health. To address inequality and foster long-term development, Stiglitz emphasizes the importance of investing in human capital. He argues that international institutions should support programs that improve access to education, healthcare, and social services. 3. Regulation of capital markets. Stiglitz advocates for stronger regulation of international capital flows to reduce the risk of financial crises. He suggests measures such as capital controls and the establishment of mechanisms to provide liquidity to countries facing sudden capital outflows. 4. Fair trade practices. To create a more level playing field in international trade, Stiglitz calls for the elimination of agricultural subsidies and other protectionist measures in developed countries. He also supporting developing countries' greater flexibility to protect their own industries and pursue policies that promote economic diversification. 5. Democratic governance of international institutions. Stiglitz argues for reforms to make the IMF, World Bank, and WTO more democratic and accountable. This includes giving greater voice to developing countries in decision-making processes and increasing transparency in their operations. Globalization and its discontents is a powerful critique of the current model of globalization and the institutions that drive it. Stiglitz combines rigorous economic analysis with compelling real-world examples to expose the flaws and injustices of this system. While he acknowledges the potential benefits of globalization, he argues that these benefits have been undermined by policies that prioritize the interests of powerful nations and corporations over those of ordinary people. Stiglitz's call for reform resonates strongly in today's globalized world, where economic inequality, political instability, and environmental challenges continue to raise questions about the sustainability of the current global order. By advocating for a more inclusive and equitable approach to globalization, Stiglitz provides a roadmap for creating a global economy that works for everyone, not just the privileged few.